The sky above the alien moon was always a deep and endless violet, stretching far beyond what the eye could measure and hiding stars that never blinked. Beneath that heavy sky, the land was silent and still as though holding its breath for centuries. In the middle of this silence, something broke the air apart. A crash that ripped across the dusty surface as a silver object fell from the sky, trailing smoke and fire behind it. It hit the ground with a force that sent waves of dust rising into the air like ghosts awakened from ancient sleep. The object was not lifeless. Inside the wreckage was a human. His name was Evan, alone, hurt and barely conscious. He lay among the broken parts of his small ship, unaware of the strange world that had become his grave or his salvation. Far from the crash site, a temple stood hidden between tall blue stone formations that looked like frozen waves. The temple belonged to the Velari, a quiet order of beings who had taken a vow of spiritual silence and sacred purity. They lived away from all species, believing that their essence flame, the energy they carried within them, was not to be touched by outsiders, not even spoken of. The arrival of a human was not just unexpected, it was dangerous. For the Velari, humans were the destroyers, the bringers of chaos, the ones who had spread across galaxies, burning as they moved. To them, a human was the end of peace and the beginning of ruin. Yet one among them was not afraid. Her name was Liara. She was young by Velari years, but her devotion had always been strong and her silence deeper than most. When the elders discussed what to do about the human who had survived the crash, Liara listened without speaking, but inside her something stirred. She had seen the wreck from a distance. She had felt the energy shift when he landed. And when she looked up at the violet sky that night, she felt something ancient move inside her chest, something she had no name for. The elders decided the human must be left to his fate. To interfere would break the vow. But Liara did not sleep that night. She walked through the quiet halls of the temple, then beyond the stone gates, into the open land, moving silently across the sand, following the pull in her chest. She found the human in the wreck, breathing shallow, weak but alive. His face was bloodied, his suit torn, and there was pain in his expression, but no fear. She watched him from a distance, hidden by the shadows, not sure what to do. He spoke once in a soft, broken voice, asking for water, asking if anyone was there. Liara felt the words, like small waves touching her feet, pulling her inward. She left without a word, returning to the temple before the twin moons rose high. But the next day, she returned again and again, always during the dark hours, always without being seen. She brought him water and placed it where he could reach. She cleaned his wounds without waking him, using healing dust from the temple gardens. Evan began to heal slowly, and each time he opened his eyes he found something new near him: food, water, warmth, as if the world itself had taken pity on him. He did not know who was helping him. He called out sometimes, thanking the empty air, whispering words meant for a stranger he could not see. And though Liara never answered him, a strange feeling grew inside her, something she did not recognize yet could not push away. Her prayers became confused. Her thoughts wandered during meditation. She no longer saw the temple walls when she closed her eyes, but the human's face, pale and tired, yet calm. It was not desire that touched her at first, but curiosity. Why was he not dangerous as the elders warned? Why did she not feel fear in his presence? Instead, there was something warm, something gentle rising from him, like the light of the small flame she carried inside her soul. She wondered if the ancient texts had been wrong, or if perhaps they had forgotten something over the ages. She began to doubt. And in a place like the Velari temple, doubt was more dangerous than any wound. But she could not stop going to him. The desert paths became familiar. The silence between them became comfort. And one evening, as he looked up at the stars and spoke softly of the home he had lost, she felt her breath catch in her chest. His words were like songs without music, full of sadness, full of longing, full of hope that something still waited for him beyond this moon. In that moment she understood something without needing the old language or sacred scrolls. The flame inside her responded to him, and she did not want to silence it anymore. The first part of their story had begun not with a greeting, not with a touch, but with quietness shared under the weight of 2 moons, and a sky that had never seen anything like this before. The nights on the alien moon passed slowly like waves drifting over still water, and each one pulled Leora closer to the edge of the life. She had always known where every step had been part of a sacred path, every breath measured every thought, tied to silence and devotion, yet ever since the human had come ever since. Her eyes had looked into his sleeping face, and her hands had cleaned blood from his wounds, without permission. Her steps had started to shift, and her breath had started to carry weight she could no longer ignore, for in that silent temple where no one questioned the old ways, her soul had begun to ask questions that would never be allowed. Evan no longer slept constantly, though his injury still held him close to the ground. His voice grew stronger each day, and with it came words Leora had never heard, not because the language was foreign, but because no one in her world spoke from the heart. The way he did, he spoke of stars not as maps but as memories. He spoke of people not as species but as stories. He spoke of himself not with pride or shame, but with a kind of honesty that cut deeper than truth. Leora listened, hidden among the tall stones, her figure still like the windless air, and with each word he offered, she felt her flame stir in ways that prayer had never achieved. One night when the moons were low and the sky turned soft with the strange glow of drifting clouds, Evan sat upright, leaning against the shattered hull of his ship, and called out, not with fear, not with demand, but with something quiet in his voice, something that sounded like faith. He said he knew someone was there. He said he felt it not just in the things left behind for him, but in the way the air changed when she came near. And then he thanked her, not with expectation, but with gratitude, pure and full, like the sun rising over a world that had almost forgotten light. Leora stepped out from the shadows, not because she had made a decision, but because something inside her heart had already done so. Without asking, her hands folded in front of her, her voice silent, yet her eyes open and watching. Evan saw her and did not recoil. Instead, he smiled, not as a conqueror or a survivor, but as someone who had found the missing word in a broken sentence. He asked her name, but she did not answer, not because she did not wish to, but because the vow she had taken wrapped itself around her tongue like a chain. Still she sat beside him, close enough for warmth, yet far enough for rule and ritual. They did not speak that night, yet something passed between them deeper than language. Evan spoke about Earth, about oceans that breathed and trees that whispered, about cities that touched the sky and children that laughed in the rain. Leora listened with wide eyes, her mind painting pictures of places she could never imagine before. Each word he gave became a seed planted in the soil of her belief, and slowly, silently, doubt began to grow like a quiet vine through the cracks of her sacred wall. Over the next nights, they met again and again, no longer separated by silence. Alone, for Leora began to speak in gestures, in drawings, in eyes that asked and answered, and Evan responded with stories, with kindness, with moments from a world that saw emotion as strength, not weakness. She learned what laughter sounded like when it was real, not part of a ceremony. She learned what sorrow looked like when it was shared, not hidden behind robes and rules. She learned what it meant to be human, not through fear, but through connection. But the temple was not blind, though the elders did not yet know her path. They felt the wind shifting. They sensed the balance of the flame tipping ever so slightly. The air in the temple halls grew heavier. The sisters moved with tighter steps, and in the sanctuary of silence, whispers of suspicion began to slither like shadows beneath the doors. Leora noticed how eyes followed her longer, how prayers around her grew colder, how the light in the sacred chamber seemed dimmer, and she knew the flame inside her was glowing, not just with warmth, but with danger. Still, she returned to Evan night after night, drawn not by rebellion, but by revelation, for she had seen something in him that no scroll had ever shown her, and felt something in herself that no ritual had ever awakened one evening, as he told her about the stars and how they burned for millions of years alone, yet still gave their light freely. She reached out and touched his hand, not as a symbol, not as a vow, but as a choice, and when their fingers met, a quiet rush moved through her veins like wind through forgotten leaves, and in that moment, she knew that her sacred gift was no longer just a concept, but a real force waiting to be given. She returned to the temple before sunrise, her steps slow, her eyes wide, her hands trembling with meaning she did not yet speak of, and though her lips remained closed, her heart whispered a truth that would soon be louder than all the silence in the world, the truth that maybe it was not the human who had changed, maybe it was her who had been waiting all this time for something real, something living, something that dared to touch the flame instead of worshiping it from afar. And in that quiet hour before morning light, she looked at the stone walls of the temple, and for the first time, she saw not safety but a cage. The days moved like shadows drifting over the ancient stones of the temple, but within Liara's heart, time had begun to burn with a different fire. Each hour felt heavier than the last, each prayer seemed farther from truth, and each silence carried a storm she could no longer contain. Her footsteps, once guided by routine, now wandered toward places forbidden. Her thoughts, once filled with devotion, now danced around a single presence, the human whose name had become a quiet echo inside her soul. Evan had become more than a voice in the night. He had become a mirror in which she saw not only herself but the pieces she had never dared to know. Flame inside her, that sacred energy passed down through generations, was not simply a light. It was a bond, a pulse of life and spirit, meant to remain untouched, pure, preserved within, until death. It was the heart of Velari, faith, the reason for their silence, the proof of their worth. And yet, Liara felt it move whenever she was near him, not weaken, but rise, not dim, but brighten, as though her essence was not meant to be locked away, but to connect, to share, to awaken something beyond ritual and rule. She began to wonder if the teachings had lost their way over time, if fear had been mistaken for holiness, if separation had been mistaken for strength. Return to Evan, not just in secret, but with purpose. Now her presence open, her eyes no longer hiding, and though she still could not speak freely, her silence no longer felt like submission. Instead, it became a kind of language that he had learned to understand through her gestures, through the expressions in her face, through the quiet kindness that passed between them like invisible threads. Evan no longer asked why she came, he only showed her what her presence meant through the way his shoulders relaxed, through the warmth in his gaze, through the way he listened to the space between her silences. One evening the sky opened with gentle rain, a rare gift on that dry moon, and Liara stood beside him, watching drops strike the dust and disappear like tiny stars falling to sleep. Evan looked at her and spoke softly, not with force, but with feeling. He told her about earth rains, about how they fed the soil, how they brought life, how they made people feel clean, and knew. She listened, her hand slowly reaching for his, not out of rebellion, not out of impulse, but out of something deeper, something that had been growing inside her like a seed finally blooming. In truth, their hands met again, and this time she did not pull away. This time she let the flame move between them. In that moment she saw memories, not her own visions of old. Velari, not cloistered in stone halls, but walking among stars, sharing their flame freely with others, using their gift to heal, to bind, to build peace. Across galaxies she saw how the vow of silence had once been a vow of reflection, not fear. How purity had meant openness, not retreat. And how the flame had never been meant for isolation, but for unity. With chosen hearts the visions faded, and she opened her eyes wide with understanding. Evan watched her, his hand still in hers, unaware of the storm her soul had just passed through, but sensing something had changed. Next day, the temple felt colder than ever. The elders summoned her with gazes sharp and full of weight. They had felt the shift in the air. They had seen the signs in the sacred chamber. The balance had altered, the energy disturbed. The high matron questioned her with words that cut like glass. asking where she had gone, what she had done, who she had touched. Leora stood silent, but no longer afraid. She did not lie. She did not bend. She looked into their eyes, and though her voice trembled, her heart stood firm. And then for the first time, she broke her vow. She spoke. She said it was not a sin if it was for the human. Her words echoed through the chamber, not as a shout, but as a flame carried in bare hands. Soft yet unyielding, the room fell into stillness, the elders frozen between fury and disbelief. One of them called it blasphemy, another called it madness. But Leora stood calm, as if the weight of centuries had fallen off her shoulders. She spoke again, not in rebellion, but in clarity. She told them that her flame had chosen, and that it was not weaker for being shared, but stronger for being awakened. They did not hear her, they only saw a threat. The High Matron declared her unclean, severed her from the order, and commanded her exile. At first she bowed, not in defeat, but in farewell. But then she turned and fled the temple, not to escape punishment, but to reach the one who had shown her the truth. Evan waited at the edge of the ruin, where the sky opened wide and the wind carried the scent of freedom. She reached him breathless, her robes torn by thorns, her eyes burning with fire. She told him everything, with words and gestures and tears that carried the story of generations. Bound in silence and now finally breaking, she told him about the sacred gift and what it meant, how it was not just energy, but a piece of her spirit, a connection deeper than flesh or thought, how it could only be given, not taken, and how she wanted to give it to him, not because she had to, but because her soul had chosen him. Evan hesitated, not from doubt, but from fear. Fear that he would take something too great, fear that he would ruin her sacredness. But she looked at him and said he was not destroying anything, he was restoring it, giving meaning to what had become empty, giving truth to what had been forgotten. They stood under the silver light of the twin moons, the flame between them glowing brighter than it ever had. And in that place between rejection and rebirth, between exile and embrace, Leora reached out and touched his chest, not to heal, not to command, but to offer. And Evan closed his eyes, letting her energy flow into him, not with force, but with faith. And in that joining, something ancient awakened, not just in them, but in the world around them, a forgotten truth finding its voice once more. Night grew deeper, and the moons above shone brighter than ever, as if even the sky wanted to witness what had just taken place between them. Leora stood still, her hands trembling, not from weakness, but from the rush of what had passed between her and Evan. Her sacred flame now flowed through him. A bond had been formed, not of body alone, but of spirit, something ancient, something powerful, something once feared by her people, yet now blooming like light through cracks in a sealed chamber. Evan had not changed in form, but something inside him now burned with new clarity, as if his soul had been wrapped in warmth after years of cold. He opened his eyes and met hers, and in that gaze there was no confusion, only peace. Leora had broken the vow that had held her life in place since the moment of her birth, yet she felt no regret, no guilt. Her people had always spoken of purity as something that must be guarded, hidden, untouched until death. But she now understood that true purity was not silence, it was truth, not distance, but connection, not fear, but love. Not all gifts are meant to be locked away, some were born to be shared, and Evan had not taken her flame, he had accepted it with reverence, and in return something inside him had healed, not just his wounds, not just his loneliness, but the very part of him that had believed he was no longer worthy of being chosen. They stayed together at the edge of the ruins where ancient Velari texts had once been carved into the stones. Long faded by time, yet alive now in the memory passed into Evan through the flame. He spoke of visions that had come to him during the transfer of places, long lost, of voices that had whispered of purpose and unity, of an old Velari tradition that once welcomed the sharing of energy across stars, across species, across hearts. The flame had never been created for hiding. It had been created for healing, and Leora felt pride in knowing that through her one forgotten truth had awakened again. Peace does not remain untouched for long, not when old beliefs stand guard over crumbling walls. The temple had not remained quiet, the disturbance in the sacred flame had not gone unnoticed, and the elders had sent watchers to follow her path. Leora and Evan were not alone as they thought. Shadows moved among the stone hills, and voices murmured in the wind. Not prayers, but orders. The temple guards came not with questions but with punishment in their minds for them. Leora had become a danger. Not because she was lost, but because she had remembered too much. When the guards arrived, their faces covered in the traditional silver veils, they spoke only once, demanding that Leora return and Evan be handed over for cleansing. Their words carried the weight of centuries of silence. But Leora did not flinch. She stood in front of Evan, her body glowing faintly from within. Her voice calm yet strong. She said that what had been done could not be undone, and that she would not allow the flame to be turned into a weapon of shame. She raised her hand, and the energy within responded not with violence, but with light. A field of warmth spread around them, not to attack, but to protect. The guards hesitated, for none had ever seen the flame used in this way before, not in living memory. It was always spoken of, never shown, and now it danced in the open sky around a woman who had once been their sister. They tried to move forward, but the energy pulsed with a strength that came not from anger, but from love, and they stopped not out of fear, but all. Leora looked into their eyes and asked them if they truly understood what the flame was meant to be, or if they only remembered what they had been told. She told them the truth, not to defy, but to awaken. Evan placed a hand on her shoulder and stepped forward, his voice steady. He said he would go if it would keep her safe. He said he would not let her suffer for choosing him, but she turned and held his face in her hands, shaking her head slowly and reminding him that this was not about sacrifice. It was about choice, about standing in the light together, not hiding from it alone. The guards stepped back, uncertain, divided within themselves, and Leora took Evan's hand and led him away into the deeper lands where the ancient flame had first been born. They walked for hours under the pale sky, through forgotten paths lined with symbols of an older time, and there in the center of an overgrown sanctuary they found a place where the flame once burned bright for all who came with open hearts. The stones still hummed with memory, and Evan knelt beside one, placing his hand on its surface and feeling the knowledge return, not just of Villari history, but of hope, of what the flame could do when not bound in chains together. They began to speak aloud to the quiet air, not in the language of the temple, but in the language of unity. They talked of building something new, not against the temple, but beyond it, a place where the flame could be shared, where connection was not forbidden, and where silence was not mistaken for strength. Leora's eyes glowed gently as she spoke, not with the authority of an elder, but with the clarity of someone who had seen the truth. And Evan beside her, no longer lost, no longer broken, listened and believed in that place among the ruins. They planted the first seed of change, not with fire or force, but with intention, and the sky above seemed to glow a little brighter, as if the stars themselves had leaned closer to witness the moment when one lost human and one forgotten nun began to light a new path with nothing but the truth of their joined souls. The wind carried no threat. Now it only whispered through the leaves of tall silver trees that grew near the ancient sanctuary, where Leora and Evan had chosen to remain hidden from the eyes of a world that still feared the unknown. The air felt different here, lighter, warmer, as though even the land itself had accepted what the temple could not. Evan moved through the stone ruins with a quiet strength, his steps firm but humble. The flame he now carried within him was no longer wild. It had settled deep in his chest, steady and alive, like a heartbeat that belonged not only to him, but to something greater. Leora watched him from a distance, her eyes calm, her thoughts open. Her robes had lost their old markings of the temple, but she did not need symbols anymore. The light inside her glowed without permission from any elder or rule. It had become her truth, and it shone in the way she spoke, the way she walked, the way she reached out to those who had once feared her and now came to listen for the Word had begun to spread through the outer lands. Young Valari, who had always questioned the silence, who had always felt the stir of something more, had begun to follow the path that led away from the temple and toward something forgotten yet familiar. They came in small numbers at first, walking cautiously among the trees, standing at the edge of the sanctuary, unsure if they belonged. But Leora welcomed them not with speeches, but with presence. She offered them her story. She showed them the energy, not as power but as connection, and she spoke not with the authority of an elder, but with the warmth of someone who had lived the journey, not read it from scrolls. Each time someone stepped into the light of that sacred place, the flame responded, not with fire but with recognition, and slowly the sanctuary began to breathe again. Evan had become more than just a survivor, more than just the human who had arrived by accident. He had become a bridge between worlds, a reminder that life did not always follow rules, but could still be right. He helped rebuild parts of the sanctuary, planting new life where the old stones had crumbled, drawing maps based on the visions that had passed through him during the flame transfer. He carried knowledge, not meant to be kept, but to be shared, not with pride, but with purpose. And as he sat beside Leora, during the gatherings of the new followers, his presence offered peace without needing words. Temple far across the hills remained untouched behind its stone walls, but even there, the change had begun to take root. Whispers among the younger sisters, questions in the eyes of those who had watched Leora leave and had not forgotten her courage. A few even left in the quiet hours, slipping into the forests not with rebellion, but with a longing to see for themselves whether the stories were true. And when they arrived and saw the sanctuary glowing under the twin moons, when they saw Leora standing not as a fallen one, but as a bearer of living light, their doubts began to break like ice under warm sun. Leora never asked them to choose. She only asked them to feel, to listen to what the flame said. When it was not surrounded by fear, when it was not told to stay silent, she spoke of unity, of healing, of remembering that purity was never meant to be separation, but sincerity. She held the hands of those who wept from confusion and let them rest among the ruins until their flame began to speak again. And Evan stood by her always, not as a leader, but as someone who had been found by love in the most unexpected place, and who now carried that love without shame. The sanctuary became more than a place. It became a path not paved in stone, but in choices made with open hearts. Some still stayed at the temple, choosing the old ways, and that was accepted too, for Leora had learned that truth could not be forced, it could only be shown. The flame was not a tool to pull others in, it was a light that drew those ready to see. And those who came did not come to follow, but to remember what it felt like to be whole, and not alone. One evening, as the stars above stretched wider than before, Leora sat beside Evan and placed her head gently on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. The moment did not need words around them. The sanctuary hummed with soft energy, with laughter from the younger ones, with stories being shared, with hands held, and songs sung in voices that had once only whispered in fear, and now dared to rise freely. The world had not changed completely, but it had begun, and that was enough. Evan looked up at the stars and smiled, not with sadness, but with wonder. His journey had begun in fire and pain, but had led him to a place where he was not a stranger, but a part of something sacred, something alive, something chosen. And when he looked at Leora, he saw not just the one who had given him her flame, but the one who had given him his life again. And somewhere in the silence of that sacred land, where old walls had crumbled and new seeds had taken root, the ancient truth returned, not in temples or scrolls, but in hearts that had finally remembered what the flame was always meant to be. And the last words he had once heard her say still echoed in his mind, soft and full of grace. She said it was not a sin if it was for a human, and now he knew she had never spoken a more beautiful truth. The end.